There are people who learned, quietly and without guidance, that the mind can become an unsafe place, not because they are broken, but because life taught them to carry more than they could understand. So they began to drift inward. They learned to detach, to dim their emotions, to step back from their own thoughts as if watching a storm from behind glass. From the outside, they may seem calm, composed, even unaffected, but inside, there is a quiet negotiation happening, a constant attempt to keep life from becoming too loud, too sharp, too overwhelming to bear. Disconnection becomes their shelter, a subtle form of survival, a way to breathe when the world, or the self within it, becomes too heavy to hold. There is a moment, often small, often unnoticed, when a person realizes that stepping back from themselves feels safer than staying present. It rarely happens in a single instant. It forms slowly, like a thin layer of frost over water, something that begins delicate, but grows stronger with time. Distance becomes a quiet shield, a way to soften sensations that once felt too sharp, too overwhelming, too intrusive to hold all at once. For many, this reflex begins as a silent adaptation. Life presents emotions that feel too complicated to name or too large to contain, and the mind does what it must. It creates space. It stretches itself just enough to keep the internal world from collapsing inward. The person may not even recognize this shift at first. They simply notice that they feel slightly apart from themselves, as if living a few inches behind their own eyes. They observe their reactions instead of experiencing them. They listen to their thoughts as though hearing someone else speak. They feel their emotions in muted tones, as if wrapped in a thin layer of quiet. And somehow, this distance feels like relief. It offers protection from the sudden rush of fear, from the heaviness of sadness, from the intensity of anger, from the unpredictable waves of emotional noise that once felt unmanageable. Disconnection becomes a way to manage what has always felt too big. To someone on the outside, this person might look calm, composed, even strong. But internally, the calmness is not the absence of emotion. It is the creation of space between emotion and awareness. It is the mind pulling back far enough to avoid drowning, but close enough to keep functioning. Many people who disconnect this way begin their emotional journey believing there is something wrong with them. They assume they are numb, detached, cold. But what looks like numbness is often a form of intelligence, a survival instinct shaped by environments where emotional presence once led to pain, confusion, or overwhelm. The mind learned early that too much could be dangerous. Too much noise, too much conflict, too much unpredictability, too much responsibility for emotions that were never theirs to manage. So the nervous system created a buffer, a psychological distance that could absorb impact without breaking. This distance is not chosen out of weakness. It is chosen because the internal world remembers what it was like to feel unprotected. As time passes, disconnection becomes familiar. It becomes the place where the mind goes when the world feels too bright or too loud. It becomes the automatic response to emotional excess, whether that excess comes from within or from others. The person who disconnects is not avoiding their life. They are simply trying to make it livable. They may notice that certain moments trigger this retreat. A sudden argument, a harsh tone, a memory that rises uninvited, a sense of being misunderstood. Even a wave of unexpected affection can trigger distance if closeness once felt dangerous. The retreat is subtle. The breath slows. The senses dull. The person feels themselves shift into observation mode, as if watching the world through a window rather than standing in it. They may still respond, still function, still appear present, but emotionally, they are a step away. And in that step away, there is safety. This chapter is not about pathology. It is about recognition. The moment a person sees the pattern clearly for the first time, the moment they understand that their distance is not a failure of connection, but the echo of an old survival strategy. People who disconnect to survive their own mind are often deeply sensitive. They feel everything strongly, even if they cannot always stay with those feelings. Their distance is not a rejection of experience. It is a way to keep experience from breaking them open. Chapter 1 ends with this truth. Disconnection is not the absence of emotion. It is the mind's quiet attempt to remain whole in a world that once felt too heavy to face directly. Before disconnection becomes a habit, before it becomes a quiet adult reflex, it begins as something far more subtle. A child sits in a room, sensing more than they understand, absorbing more than they can express. There is no language yet for fear or overwhelm or emotional abandonment. There is only the nervous system, learning in real time what the world will allow and what it won't. Children do not disconnect because they want distance. They disconnect because presence feels unsafe. Sometimes the danger is loud, shouting, chaos, volatility. Sometimes it is quiet, silence, emotional absence, an adult whose face never softens. Sometimes it is inconsistency, affection one moment, withdrawal the next, leaving the child unsure of how to exist without losing balance. No matter the form, the lesson becomes clear. Emotions are unpredictable, and vulnerability carries a cost. So the child adapts in the only way they can, by retreating inward, by learning to stay small, by lowering their emotional volume until it barely registers. This is how a survival instinct takes root. Emotional disconnection in adulthood is often the echo of a childhood where feelings were either too much for others or too unimportant to be noticed. A child who grows up in such an environment learns early that their inner world must be tightly managed. They learn to compress themselves, to filter their needs, to offer only the parts of their emotional life that feel safe enough for the adults around them. Some children grow up with parents who are physically present but emotionally distant. These children learn that connection is unpredictable, and that trying to express their inner world will lead to disappointment. So they swallow their feelings quietly, not because they want to, but because the emotional landscape around them offers no room for expression. Others grow up in environments filled with chaos. They witness anger or fear in ways that overwhelm their young nervous systems. In those moments, the body does what it must. It freezes, numbs, disconnects. It hides inside itself to survive sensations that feel unbearable. The child learns to drift mentally when reality becomes too loud. And then, there are those who grow up playing roles they never chose. The caretaker, the peacekeeper, the good one who never complains, the child who holds everything together because no one else will. These children learn that their emotions are secondary, that their needs are optional, that survival depends on staying composed, controlled, and outwardly strong. Disconnection becomes the only way to keep functioning when the emotional weight of the household becomes too heavy to carry. Years later, the adult version of this child may not remember the exact moments that shaped them, but their nervous system does. The body does not forget what it had to do to make childhood livable. The mind does not forget the cost of feeling too much too soon. Disconnection becomes a blueprint, an inherited pattern, rather than a conscious choice. Adults who disconnect often believe they are doing something strange or wrong. Yet in truth, they are simply following the emotional architecture that childhood built for them. They are reenacting a survival pattern that once kept them safe. The adult may feel numb during conflict, detached during intimacy, quiet in moments that call for vulnerability, distant even when they desperately want closeness. This is not because they lack emotion. It is because their earliest lessons taught them that emotional presence was unsafe, unwelcomed, or overwhelming. Childhood leaves invisible fingerprints on the nervous system. It shapes how a person senses danger, how they respond to stress, and how they interpret emotional cues. It determines whether the world feels like a place to open up or a place to hide within. And so the adult who disconnects is not malfunctioning. They are remembering. They are reliving patterns carved into their emotional memory long before they had the words to explain them. Chapter 2 ends on this understanding. Disconnection is not born in adulthood. It is the quiet inheritance of a childhood that asked the mind to survive before it learned how to feel. Long before a person realizes they are disconnecting, the body has already made its decision. The nervous system scans the world constantly, quietly, without conscious permission. It looks for danger. It tracks tone, silence, posture, memories, tension. It compares everything to what it learned long ago. And when a familiar threat, emotional or physical, appears, the brain activates its oldest survival mechanism. Not fight, not flight, but distance. A soft, internal slipping away. This is not a dramatic collapse. It is not the chaos we imagine when we think of panic or emotional overwhelm. Disconnection is quieter than that. It is the body choosing stillness over chaos. It is the brain turning down the volume of experience so a person can keep functioning. Psychologists often call it dissociation. Neuroscientists call it hypoarousal. The body calls it safety. It begins with the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, sending a message that something feels too intense. The threat may not be real. It may be a memory, a tone of voice, a sudden change, a familiar emotional atmosphere that mirrors something old. The brain cannot always tell the difference. It only knows that something feels dangerous. So it activates the freeze response. Heart rate slows. Muscles soften. Awareness retracts like a wave pulling back from the shore. The person becomes present enough to function, but distant enough to avoid being overwhelmed. To the outside world, this may look like calm, stillness, composure. Inside, it is the body moving into survival mode. Disconnection is often misunderstood because it does not look dramatic. People who dissociate may continue talking, listening, working, or smiling. They may go through the motions of their day without anyone noticing the shift. Yet emotionally, they are watching life from a slight distance, as if behind a pane of glass. This internal split happens because the brain is trying to protect itself from too much stimulation. When the nervous system senses that staying fully present might lead to emotional flooding, it creates a buffer, a mental cushion, a small space where feelings cannot land with their full weight. This is why people often describe disconnection as, "I feel foggy. I feel unreal. It's like I'm here, but not fully here. I can hear myself talking, but it doesn't feel like me." These sensations are not failures. They are physiological strategies. Even emotional numbness, often mistaken for apathy, is a biological adaptation. The brain releases chemicals that reduce emotional intensity, minimizing pain. This numbing effect is not a sign of detachment from life. It is a sign that life has become too overwhelming for the nervous system to process at once. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning and decision-making, quietly steps in to maintain order. It keeps the person functioning, stable, and aware enough to navigate daily tasks. Meanwhile, the emotional centers of the brain dim their signals to avoid overload. It is a delicate balancing act, a psychological compromise, a way to feel just enough without feeling too much. For some, these mechanisms activate during conflict. For others, during intimacy. For many, during moments of unexpected vulnerability or confrontation. The trigger is not the situation itself, but the nervous system's interpretation of it, shaped by years of stored experiences. This is why disconnection can feel confusing. A person may not understand why they shut down during affection, or why their mind goes blank during confrontation. They may wonder why they suddenly feel distant in moments that logically should be safe. But the body does not operate on logic. It operates on memory. The brain learns to protect before it learns to trust. And so, disconnection becomes a form of quiet self-preservation, an escape mechanism that allows a person to remain functional while avoiding emotional overload. Chapter 3 ends with this truth. Disconnection is not an act of avoidance. It is the nervous system choosing survival over sensation until the world feels safe enough to stay fully awake. There comes a point, quiet, almost invisible, when the person who disconnects begins to sense the conflict inside them, a subtle ache, a tension that has no clear shape. They want to feel, they want to be present, they want to belong to themselves without drifting away. Yet the moment emotion rises, the instinct to hide awakens just as quickly. This is the silent war they live with, the longing for connection versus the fear of being overwhelmed. On some days, they can feel the warmth of closeness. A conversation lands softly. A moment of affection feels safe. A memory surfaces without pulling them under. These moments feel like light breaking through a room that has been dim for years. They tell themselves that maybe they are finally ready to be present. But presence is not simple. Presence is vulnerable. And vulnerability is the terrain they were taught to avoid. So when emotional intensity builds, whether from conflict, intimacy, nostalgia, or even joy, their system pulls them back into the familiar distance. They dissociate, they numb, they retreat. Not because they want to, but because their body still believes that staying fully open is dangerous. This contradiction creates a deep internal ache, the desire to feel alive while quietly fearing aliveness itself. It is a strange form of loneliness. A loneliness that occurs not because others are absent, but because the person cannot stay with themselves long enough to feel connected. They may sit beside someone they love and feel an invisible wall growing between them. They may try to articulate what's happening, but words dissolve before they form. How does one explain, "I want to feel you, but my body won't let me"? The conflict grows sharper when they begin to recognize the cost of their survival mechanism. They see how disconnection has protected them, but also how it has taken pieces of their emotional life. They notice the emptiness that follows after every shutdown. They feel the hollow echo of moments they wanted to fully experience but couldn't. This is the turning point. The moment awareness begins to soften the old pattern, not by force, not by pushing, but by gently acknowledging the truth of their inner world. Awareness creates a small opening. The person starts to recognize the exact second they begin to pull away. They notice the breath that shortens, the chest that tightens, the mind that begins to drift toward safety. They realize that the retreat is not a failure, but a message, an old memory rising like a reflex. This recognition is not healing yet, but it is the doorway to it. Slowly, the person learns that the body disconnects not to punish them, but to protect them. And if the body can protect, it can also relearn. It can discover new rhythms of presence, new ways of tolerating emotion, new experiences of safety and connection. Healing begins in moments so small, they often go unnoticed. A few extra seconds of staying present before the retreat, a slightly deeper breath during a triggering moment, an attempt to name a feeling instead of escaping it. These moments do not erase the old pattern, but they begin to reshape it. They widen the window of tolerance. They teach the nervous system that not every rise of emotion is a threat. Healing in this world is not a dramatic transformation. It is the gradual return to one's own inner landscape. And integration is the final step. Not the end of disconnection, but the understanding of it. The person learns to coexist with their survival instincts instead of fighting them. They understand that distance is part of their story, but not the entirety of it. They begin to feel emotions in fuller tones, not because they eliminated fear, but because they learned to hold both fear and feeling at the same time. Integration is not the disappearance of disconnection. It is the gentle reconciliation with it. This chapter ends with a quiet truth. People who disconnect to survive are not broken. They are learning, slowly and bravely, how to return to themselves without losing the safety they once needed to stay alive.